Okay, so I am joined by Professor of History at Mountain View Community College, Andrew McGregor. Andrew founded Sports in American History and continues to co-edit today that website. I stumbled across it because, Andrew wrote this really great piece for the Washington Post about sports and politics, particularly as it pertained to college football. And then I found out he wrote his dissertation about Bud Wilkinson. I was like, man, I got to talk to this dude. And then he said, yes. And now we're joined by Andrew. Andrew, how you doing, man?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm good, brother. I sincerely appreciate you taking time. I get that perhaps this is going to be a niche conversation, but it's for nerds like me and you. So first, I wanted to ask, what led you down this rabbit hole of sports in history, and then politics and how it has always been a part of sports?
Well, I guess it started as I grew up in Kansas, and Kansas is obsessed with sports. Particularly college basketball. And I myself was as an athlete. I ran cross country and track, and I ran small college cross country and track, and spent a couple of years coaching after I finished my own athletic career. And I just started to be exposed to different policies and rules, and I was like, why do we have to do this? Why do we have to do this? Why do we use the term student athlete? Why do we use this term? And I started asking a bunch of questions, and I'd always loved history. And so as I had studied history, thought of being a history teacher and a coach, I started realizing that I could study the history of the thing that I was obsessed with, and that was sports. And so it sort of grew organically out of my own athletic career and my own interest in history that I could study the combination of these two. And you start seeing contradictions when you get in deeper and deeper into sports as both a fan and as an athlete yourself, and then as a coach. So that sort of inspired me to dig deeper into some of these issues. And I sort of grew to love football as a fan, but also that's where all the big stuff happens. Football is sort of the major sport, both politically and economically, and so that's where, if you want to study the history of sports, football is really the place to start for me, at least college sports, I should say.
So when you were going to study college football and the politics that are involved in it, what were some of the things that you just blew your mind that perhaps didn't get enough publicity or just went away because the age of what we think of as college football continued to grow, and we're at 150 years now, and we look at it entirely differently today than we did in 1922, and in some ways it's really the same.
Well, one of the things that blew me away was that college sports were created and sort of nurtured and developed almost entirely by students themselves for the first 10 to 20 years. And so they didn't have athletic directors, they didn't have coaches, they didn't have people organizing things other than the students themselves. And so college sports developed out of the student, like intramurals almost, the student clubs. And then once they realized that they could make money off of them, then universities and schools decided, let's get involved with this. And then one of the things that has been consistent in my mind throughout the history of college football is the people have been making money off of it. And there's always been questions about eligibility, who should be playing, who shouldn't be playing. There's always questions about recruitment and things like that. Those questions are, again, they're evergreen. They've been there since the beginning of the sport, when it was a student activity and then when it became sort of incorporated under the university model. There's an interesting story at OU that I write about where there's a player named, I can't remember his name. It's 1947. His name will come to me. But he wanted to go to OU, and Bud Wilkinson offered him a scholarship and created a summer job for him so he could go to school. And then Arkansas comes in, and they offer his dad a $4,000 Cadillac if he goes to Arkansas. Or I think it's a Buick, actually. And so he ends up going to Arkansas in the fall, and Bud Wilkinson and the alumni are like, why aren't you coming here to Oklahoma? And once he tells them that he didn't want his dad to have to give the car back so he could go to the school he wanted to, the alumni will raise $4,000 and pay off the car and more or less ransom him and put him on a private jet and fly him to Oklahoma. And so recruiting battles like that in the 1940s, but you have people with slush funds and recruiting battles even in the 1920s, that has been there, and that doesn't sound that different than Reggie Bush in 2005 and continuing ongoing recruiting struggles. And so the fact that this has been there the entire time was something that's fascinated me.
So you brought up what I think of as one of the coolest parts and also the salacious parts of college football, which is how recruiting is actually done. But before the NCAA, this is what we had. How did the NCAA really change how we view college athletics with the moniker student athlete?
Well, the NCAA had tried to. The NCAA gets its start out of a White House conference at Theodore Roosevelt around 1905, when they're trying to react to football violence and football deaths. And so another thing that's sort of been universal besides money is the violence of the sport. They've always been concerned with the crisis of people getting hurt or injured. And so the NCAA was one of these organizations that was developed to help clean up the sport. And they outlaw things like the mass momentum play or the flying wedge. And eventually they'll adopt the forward pass to help clean up the game. The NCAA doesn't get involved in sort of regulation of eligibility and things like that until they start developing the Purity Code and the Sanity Code around 1945 into 1950. And the NCAA's modern situation of penalties and being on probation and all of that starts about 1953. And Oklahoma, by the way, I think is the third university put on probation because of some of these things that I just mentioned. And so they use that as a way to sort of police the game and say, okay, well, you need to be eligible, and we're trying to clean up recruiting and all of that. The term student athlete is actually imposed around the 1950s as well, and a result of a lawsuit about wrongful death. And in order to absolve themselves from being responsible for the death of a football player, the NCAA will coin the term student athlete, saying that they are not an employee and that they were in a voluntary activity and that they can't be sued for workers' compensation because of that. And so student athlete is part of this, let's keep the money out, let's define you as an amateur student, not as an employee, and that will absolve us from certain amounts of liability. And so this mix of money and violence really results in that phrasing, student athlete.
And now it seems that phrase is used or was used for such a long time to prevent athletes from profiting on their name, image, and likeness. Did you find any examples of athletes doing that in college prior to the NCAA adopting this policy?
No, there's not really a good example of athletes sort of profiting off of their name and likeness. Obviously, you have Olympians that will try to do that. So when we think of, there's a lot of pushback in the 70s about the amateur code and Olympians and trying to make a lot of money and trying to get certain sponsorship. But I can't think of an example where an athlete was able to do so, regardless of sport, really prior to the 1980s or 90s. In the 80s and 90s, you have the loosening of some of those restrictions by the International Olympic Committee. And there are actually separate rules that the NCAA will allow certain Olympians to make money because of their achievement. Like when you win a gold medal, you get so much money, or you get so much endorsements or whatever else. And so there are sort of phrases where we exclude certain sports because of their Olympic nature. And so that's been in there for a while. When we think of the likeness and the marketing money, most people are talking about football and basketball, and I can't think of an example where that has happened.
But we do know about coaches that have been able to do this for some time, and the conversation around the money that is made by, in particular, college football coaches at big-time programs like Oklahoma versus the kind of money that can be made by, let's say, the star quarterback has kind of really started to rub some people the wrong way. But as I understand it, that's basically been true since we've begun to think of college football teams as being things that are basically personifications of football coaches. So I guess my question is, why? Why did we decide?
Okay.
Why did we decide that it was a bigger deal for the coach to be the coach than the player to be the player?
Well, part of the justification of sports, the reason why we have sports in an educational, institutional setting, because why do we need sport in schools? What's the point? It's sort of a question that a lot of us don't ask anymore. But one of the points was that sports are supposed to teach us education. They're character development. They teach us to behave in certain ways. They teach us to be men. They teach us, to respect authority and be disciplined and all that. And so the coach is viewed as the instructor, as a leader of men. And so the coach will personify because what he's doing is implementing his personality, his order, his structure, his system onto his team. And so your team is comprised, it's in the image of that coach. At least that's part of the belief from the beginning on. And so when we think about character development, and there's this period in the late 19th century called muscular Christianity that said when, in order to be a strong Christian, you need to have a developed, disciplined body. And so sports and Christianity went hand in hand. And so you have, major sports like basketball and volleyball developed by the YMCA, which is the Young Men's Christian Association. So there's the Christian component there. And that's where James Naismith comes out of, and that's where Amos Alonzo Stagg comes out of. And Stagg is the first professionally paid college coach at the University of Chicago in 1890. And that will roll into being, hiring paid coaches to be physical education instructors as well as coaches throughout the country. And that's where we see the development of modern sport at the college level from the early 20th century. And out of that, you see major coaches become these, flagship sort of personalities that embody their whole program. And so at Notre Dame, you have Knute Rockne. And Knute Rockne is famous for being the face of Notre Dame, but he's also famous for being one of the first entrepreneurial coaches who will have endorsements with things like Barbasol shaving cream and Studebaker automobiles. And so he'll be the face of Notre Dame, but he'll also be the face of these brand corporations. And so that goes us back to, okay, here's this man who's a respected leader who's developing the best football team in the country in the 1920s, and as well as selling you all these different products. And so there's that mix of sort of character development and personality with marketing that comes through in the 20s that has sort of lingered with us ever since.
We're in a very interesting and weird time in sports right now, as we're seeing a hard stop on sporting events. And when I asked you to do this, the COVID-19 coronavirus had not shut down sports as we know it, but it has now. So I need to ask, can you think of a time when we had this sort of all stop, perhaps since World War II?
Since World War II, I can't think of one. Obviously, the Second World War, and in 1918, there was a flu virus, which is comparable to this, that shut down a lot of things, canceled a lot of games. I can think of a few OU games were canceled in 1918 because of the Spanish-American flu. But post-World War II, maybe 9/11 shut it down for a week or two. But beyond that, there hasn't been a national crisis that's really threatened sports.
Which is wild to think about, that we're living in those times. Getting back to sort of Oklahoma and all of this conversation, you wrote in your Washington Post piece about a story that many of us know about, with George Lynn Cross going to a state senator saying, "I want a university our football team can be proud of," and how we take that quote and we twist it to a means that I don't think that he meant. I think he wanted a great university, and he's a botanist, but he also inspired this really rabid base around football. What were the ramifications about that? And if you could give some background about that story.
Yeah, so the statement was actually sort of a sarcastic reply, because there was this old sleepy, state legislature in the back. It's like, why do you need more money for your university? Your university has plenty of money. You liberal academics don't need any more money. You do nothing anyway. And that's sort of that anti-intellectual viewpoint that comes through even today a little bit towards professors as being these, hoity-toity people. And they had gone through, like this legislator had gone through the budget and said, why do we need to spend this much money on like a vase for the museum? And he was really trying to like say the university is a luxury. And George Cross was like, well, the only thing that people then really liked about the university was the football team. And so he's like, well, I want to build a university the football team can be proud of. And so he's like, you already have the best football team in the country. Well, why don't we have the best university in the country as well? And that's really what he meant by this, because he was trying to advocate for more funding for the university. And at that point, Oklahoma had among the lowest salaries in the Big Eight. Or it would have been the Big Seven at that point, but it becomes the Big Eight and the Big 12. And so having a university with some of the lowest salaries made it hard for them to recruit and keep faculty members. And so how do we build a world-class university to match our world-class football team? And that's really what he means in that statement. I want to build a university that the football team can be proud of. Also, we allegedly pay our athletes with free education, right? That's how that's how they're compensated. North Carolina taught us a couple of years ago that doesn't have to be good education. They can take fake classes. They're still getting paid with education. And the NCAA doesn't care about that. At least it seems they don't. And so the idea of having a high quality education that can benefit the football team is part of what he's saying. But that's part of the thing we're still wrestling with today is, what does that mean? Are we actually paying our athletes with a good education? We think we are, but in some cases we're not, because of, the kind of majors they're allowed to enroll in, or the kind of classes they're taking, or the independent studies, or the online education, and whether or not that's the same rigor, or whether the student actually has the ability to take what they are interested in taking to work around their, athletic practice schedule.
It leads me to another question about this this really incongruence with the education versus the product on the field versus what universities think is important and what athletic departments think is important into, hey man, it didn't feel like there was a lot of money in this until everybody decided that college football was the thing. And there was a time when that wasn't true. What are some of the variables that continue to make that such a big deal? Is it as simple as it's just been around for a long time? Or is it a common occurrence of events that have something to do with psychology? Because that's the part of this history that I get really interested in, is when did we all decide that college football was the sport?
I mean, in some ways, it's been the beginning. As soon as they realized they could make money off of it, which was within 20 years of the first college. I mean, by 1900, college football was pretty much solidified. To give an example, the media makes as much money off of college football as the university does, and so the New York World and the New York Journal, the two leading newspapers in the 1900s, late 1900s or around 1900, 1890s, they were owned by Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst, two of the leading newspapermen. They created sports pages just for the whole purpose of selling newspapers. And so the idea of the development of the sports paper was to help newspapers sort of exist and survive. And we can see that the media was making a lot of money off of it, and they were popularizing the sport. And so it's sort of the development of modern media and modern sport go hand in hand in that regard, in the early 20th century. And so we can see some of that development happening in terms of sport and money always working together. Now, universities sort of realized that, hey, sports give us media exposure. And so the university has sort of developed sports as, people use the phrase, the front porch of the university is the athletic program. And so sports become the way that we market our universities. There's been studies done that say if you win a national title, your freshman application rate will go up a certain amount. And so we see that as a flagship thing. And then going back to the George Lynn Cross quote, the fan base who are paying, the state taxpayers who are paying for the university think, oh, well, what good am I getting out of this university? Well, I'm getting a good entertainment thing. And so we have these universities that are seen as possessions of the state, and the only good that they really see out of the university is the athletic program. And so there's that relationship with money and media and marketing that sort of goes all the way back to the beginning. How does that look today? It's still a challenge today. Like, we're still working on, why do we need sports at the university? Do we need sports at the university? Are sports really doing that sort of character development? Are they impacting the whole university, or is this just a money-making grab? And then the whole question of how do we pay, or should we pay them, goes back into who benefits and who doesn't benefit, and then there's questions of race and ethics, right? And so it explodes into this more complicated nature. But at the beginning, it was about, okay, media wanted to make money by selling more newspapers. Universities wanted to get their name out there. And if a university from the Midwest beats a university from the East Coast, then all of a sudden we seem like we're on the same sort of prestigious level as they are.
When you take a look at politicians and college football programs, college football teams, one of the things that I really picked up on, and I think a lot of fans in the Big 12, is Ann Richards is said to have put her thumb on the scale to make sure that Baylor got into the Big 12 when conference realignment was a thing. And now we've seen at least one more conference realignment in the past 10 years, and we're probably going to see another. How much are we really going to see politicians get involved in this thing again, even as they're doing it right now with name, image, and likeness? And how much have they been tied to a college football program in their rise from, let's say, state senator to even governor of a state?
Well, those are sort of two separate issues. One is, what's the role in politicians in terms of, maintaining a certain level of prestige, right? Like Baylor, had they not been in the Big 12, they would have been in, Conference USA or whatever SMU's in now, the American. And so, you look at a school like SMU or even TCU before they got invited to the Big 10, or Rice even. Rice used to be on the same level as some of these Big 12 teams, and we forget that. And so Baylor very astutely wanted to make sure that they had access to that sort of level of prestige. And so there's been sort of a conflation between athletic success and academic or university level. And so if you're an Ivy League, that means a certain thing. But if you're Division I, that's supposed to mean you're a certain class of university. That's not always entirely true, but because we've associated athletics and academics so intimately, that the politics behind it is trying to make sure that our marketing or our image survives a certain level. And so I think the Ann Richards situation is a perfect example of that. And you see that, at other universities that are scared that they're going to be left behind. Or like the Board of Regents, Kansas gets elected to a great conference. What happens to Kansas State? Well, there's some universities, or some, not universities, there's some politicians who want to make sure that their rivalries maintain each other. I know there used to be a lot of debate whether or not Oklahoma and Tulsa should play each other every year, and I think they do now. But in the 30s, they didn't.
No, they don't.
They don't play each other, but they play each other pretty regularly.
About every 4 years.
But who benefits from that? Does Tulsa benefit from it more than Oklahoma? Probably. And so there's some of that legislative idea about legislating schedules, because this will help us, include certain rivalries, but will also make fans of Tulsa feel like they're on the same level as fans of even though they might not be on the field. Now that's a separate issue, I think, from politicians. Tom Osborne became a politician after he became wildly famous as the Nebraska football coach, and Bud Wilkinson at Oklahoma, he ran for Senate in 1964. He lost by 21,000 votes because he sided with an unpopular presidential candidate and was caught up in the sort of Lyndon Johnson landslide. But you have politicians who are emerging from their experience as a coach or as an athlete, and because of their fame, they're getting more involved, and there is some electability there. We think of this more happening with actors like Ronald Reagan or Jack Kennedy Cook, but there are examples of Wilkinson happening, and obviously Tom Osborne. And so, in these states where football is king, Nebraska and Oklahoma, you can see that because you develop this sort of reputation as a leader of men, as a respectful person, and some of these qualities I've already talked about, they endear themselves to a certain fan base, along with winning pedigree that, this is the kind of person I want to lead my country. These are the kind of values I want for America. And so you can see this really mixing of coaching and athletics and politics that spins again on that marketing or that publicity and personality.
Yeah, and we're seeing that with Tommy Tuberville right now as he's trying to run for office.
That's right.
Yeah, in Alabama. It's Andrew McGregor, who is professor of history at Mountain View and founded Sports in American History blog, where they review books about sports in America, and it's very good, and it's very much worthwhile. Andrew, hey man, thanks for taking so much time to talk with me about this. It's fascinating stuff.
No problem. I appreciate it.